to review for you the kind of symptoms, things that are happening to people around the world who are exposed to this form of radiation. As you can see on this chart, this shows the frequency of electromagnetic hypersensitivity symptoms based on distance to a cell phone base station. The kinds of symptoms people are experiencing, as you see on the left chart, is fatigue, sleep disturbance, headaches, difficulty concentrating, depression, memory loss, visual disruptions, and so on. Myriad of symptoms that are being misdiagnosed. And so as you see, the closer you are to the tower, the greater these symptoms are. There is other research that's been linking cell phone towers to cancer. There was a study in the International Journal of Cancer Prevention done at Tel Aviv University that showed a fourfold increase in cancer risk among Israelis who were living for over a decade within 350 meters of a cell phone tower. Other studies from Israel have showed neurobehavioral malfunction, lower than average performance tests for attention and short-term memory and problem solving, and a host of other inexplicable illnesses. This sort of research, similar results are coming out in other countries such as France, Germany, and Austria. Just to give you a very quick overview of the known biological effects from electromagnetic fields, which Dr. Blank is going to be focused more on later, we know that there are genetic effects, cancer, cellular and molecular changes, nervous system issues, permeability in the blood-brain barrier, cardiovascular irregularities, sleeping disorders, hormonal and other endocrine system problems, immune system, metabolic changes, autoimmunity, and fertility. So that's just to give you the big broad brush that we are blanketing our world in frequencies that are harming people and creating known biological effects. Now, it's not all from cell phones and cell phone towers, but other things that you might not suspect, such as a portable phone, radiation from your bedside is creating the same kind of effect as from your cell phone. This is a chart that shows some research that will be published in the new year that some people who are exposed to this form of radiation have heart irregularities, symptoms like tachycardia and arrhythmia. This is an example of somebody whose heart rate almost doubled on exposure to a decked portable phone. And then when the exposure was removed, the heart rate went back to the baseline. When it re-exposed, it almost doubled again. Not everybody has this kind of effect on the heart, but some people do. And the people who are electrically sensitive are getting a wide range of symptoms that are being misdiagnosed. This is a statement from Professor Franz Adelkofer from Germany, who was the coordinator of the Reflex Report, which was a report by 12 institutes in 7 countries that looked at the potential for long-term genetic damage in the blood and brains from mobile phone use. And he says, this study shows there is real evidence that hyperfrequency electromagnetic fields can have genotoxic effects, and this damaged DNA is always the cause of cancer. We found these damaging effects on the genes at levels well below the safety limits, and that's why we think it's urgent to base our safety limits on the biological effects, not on the thermic ones. They should be based on biology, not on physics. Now, this is the crux of the whole issue here, is that our safety guidelines are based on the false assumption that if there is not a heating effect, if there's no thermal effect that's impacting the tissue, there is no harm. And this has been long since out of date, and other countries are responding and recommending lowered exposures, and in our country, we are taking no steps to protect people at this point in time. A lot of the science, if you want to go further into it, has been summarized in a report called the Bioinitiative Report that came out in August of 2007. Those studies were later peer-reviewed and published in the Journal of Pathophysiology this past March in a special issue edited by Dr. Martin Blank, who you'll hear from in a moment. This just gives you an idea of the growth in exposures that we are experiencing. If you look back down at the year 2000, the levels of exposure in this particular urban area were 30 microwatts per meter squared, which is a level that many people would consider unsafe in and of itself. And the trajectory is, as you can see, we are just adding layer upon layer upon layer of these frequencies to our lives. Today we're at levels that are well above international guidelines such as the Salzburg guidelines and the building biology standards for extreme concern. I want to give you an idea of what's happening around the world. Here are some women in France protesting antennas in schools. Many schools are collecting revenue today for putting antennas on their property, some very significant revenue. Here are some people protesting in Barcelona, some other people in France. This is a tower being taken down by residents in England. There are many instances of people actually bombing cell phone towers in Ireland and Spain. They're using a plastic explosive that is, taken down a couple of towers. In Australia, there was a retired telecom technician who stole a tank recently and rammed down 6 towers to the ground. In Israel last year, there were 20 instances of tower sabotage with hundreds of people in the street and with dozens of police harmed. Not much is happening in this country yet. We did have Senate hearings recently in September, as well as some hearings in the House a year ago, but really not too much is happening. 3 U.S. governments did declare May Electromagnetic Hypersensitivity Awareness Month, so that's a step in the right direction. A lot of local governments and school districts are starting to agitate on this issue, and the LA Unified School District has called for a repeal of Section 704 of the Telecommunications Act, which Mr. Seymour will be talking more about later, which took away state and local governments' rights to limit this kind of exposure. The European Parliament is a sign of hope. They have taken a very strong stand on this issue, and last April they voted overwhelmingly recommending that precautions be taken to protect health from cell phones, Wi-Fi, routers, and the like. France has just banned cell phones in primary school, and they're also requiring manufacturers to come up with a phone that doesn't have the ability to put it to the head. It won't have a speakerphone. It will just have a texting ability to appease parents who say they need to be in touch with their children. Some other interesting tidbits: the Paris library system installed a Wi-Fi system, and people were having difficulty concentrating, getting different sorts of irregularities, and they ended up having to remove it. In the UK, there's a teachers' union of 38,000 teachers that are pushing to take Wi-Fi out of schools. Lakehead University in Canada became the first university to ban Wi-Fi on the campus. The National Library of France, which is the equivalent of our Library of Congress, has taken out the Wi-Fi based on the precautionary principle. There's enough evidence now that we really ought to be looking seriously at this. And then the International Association of Firefighters, they were getting complaints from their members that the firemen and women were having difficulty concentrating, having slow reflexes, and headaches and all kinds of other problems. And so they reviewed the literature, and they also did some studies of their own, and based on that they have called for no cell phone antennas anywhere near a firehouse. Same should apply to the police. Of course, you don't want any safety personnel being in an impaired cognitive state. This is in southeastern France. There's now an EMF refuge zone that is opened up for people who are electrically sensitive. There are applications just overwhelming them for people who want to move there. This is how they're living. They're living in trailers, which are metal and protect them from any minimal amount of radiation that's there. Mostly there's very, very low levels. This is a little boy in Oslo, Norway, who's become so sensitive that he can't even go to school. He has to be homeschooled. He gets very sick, and when he does need to go out and about for some reason in the city, he has to wear this metal mesh tent over his body to protect him. The impact on children is very significant, and they are more vulnerable. Here's a quote from Dr. Thomas Rau of the Paracelsus Clinic in Switzerland, who says that it's criminal to expose children to this form of radiation. He says, "We know that power stations for electromagnetic waves like mobile phones are hurting the brains of children, so to put such stations into schools is really very, very bad." Here's a picture of what happens, the radiation penetration of skulls, and over on the right you see a 5-year-old's brain, and on the left you see an adult, and you see it goes much deeper into the brain of a child. And so many countries around the world are starting to issue precautions on the use of this kind of technology for children. The Russians have recommended that children under 18 not use a cell phone at all. And other countries such as the UK, Israel, Belgium, Germany, Finland, and India have all issued warnings that children should curtail their use of these technologies. This is a statement by Professor Yuri Grigoriev, who is chairman of the Russian National Committee on Non-Ionizing Radiation Protection. He says that members of the Russian National Committee on Non-Ionizing Radiation Protection have emphasized ultimate urgency to defend children's health from the influence of electromagnetic fields from mobile communications systems and the need to protect the health of future generations. Now, another thing, there's very little research on this, but the early indications are that we need to be concerned about the potential connection between electromagnetic fields and bee colony collapse. We've lost a third of our honeybee population, and bees pollinate a third of our crops. While there are other theories of why this could be, like ranging from mites and stress and viruses and pesticides called neonicotinoids, what's different about this is that in this case the bees are not necessarily dying, they're disappearing, and they're disappearing in droves. And there is early research showing that in the presence of a microwave radiation, the bees come back to their hives and then they turn around and they leave. So I highly recommend anyone concerned about the environment and our survival ultimately to read the study by Ulrich Warnke from Germany that's on my website, electromagnetic.health.org. It's called Bees, Birds, and Humans: The Destruction of Nature by Electrosmog. So this is a big potential issue. Fertility also is a big potential issue, and these are French men protesting the known impact on fertility from these fields in France in this way. There is research from the Cleveland Clinic that shows that a third of sperm count was lost with 4 hours of cell phone use, and there's plenty of research from other countries around the world as well confirming this. So we need to really be paying attention here. Situations like this beautiful valley in Switzerland that would have been like idyllic looking, now you can see things are not as they look on the surface. They are filled with electropollution, and we are not being conscious of. Here is a school in France where they're concealing an antenna on the top of the school underneath the fake chimney. I'm not going to talk long about cell phones and brain tumors, but this is a subject I know a lot of people are interested in. We published a paper, 8 of us, called Cell Phones and Brain Tumors, 15 Reasons for Concern. You can download it free on electromagnetic.health.org. It's been covered all around the world in the news. And suffice it to say that industry's own research going back to 1999 showed a statistically significant link with brain tumors. And subsequent independent and industry research also shows the link. So here's an example of some of the things that we're up against. When a recent meta-analysis of cell phones and brain tumors came out, it was done by a Korean team. The first headline on Reuters that day was that it says, "Study charts link between mobile phones and tumors." And it says, the subheading was, "High-quality studies often show potential cancer link. Industry-funded studies most likely to show no link." Okay, that was at 4 o'clock. A couple hours later, if you go look for the story, they've changed the subheading. It's the same story, same title, and same story by the same journalist, but the subheading has changed to, "It found no significant association between the risk of tumors and overall use of mobile phones, including cellular and portable phones." Our FDA is also a point of resistance. Despite all thousands of studies showing biological effect, here's what they say about the non-thermal effects. They say, whereas high levels of RF can produce health effects by heating tissues, exposure to low-level RF that does not produce heating effects causes no known adverse health effects. Dr. Blank will address the truth of that statement in a moment. And then on children and cell phones, they say the scientific evidence does not show a danger to any users of cell phones from RF exposure, including children and teenagers. This is in great contrast to what the statements are from other countries around the world, including the EU, and here are a few of the EU's recommendations. They're calling for increased communication about the potential health hazards of wireless technologies, funding for a wide-ranging awareness campaign aimed at young people, a review of the scientific basis and adequacy of present exposure guidelines, and that certain establishments be wireless free, and that includes schools, daycare centers, retirement homes, and healthcare institutions. So we stand in stark contrast to what other governments are recommending. So I thank you very much for being here and listening to us today. I'm going to turn it over now to Dr. Martin Blank from the Department of Physiology and Cellular Biophysics up at Columbia Uptown. who is a leading expert in this field and the former president of the Bioelectromagnetic Society. And if you would like to get more information on this, go to electromagnetichealth.org. There's a tremendous amount of information there, and most of it is totally free, and you can really get up to speed fast. Also, if you, on your way out, if you'd like to take a book, we're offering anyone who came today a free book of a Public Health SOS, The Shadow Side of the Wireless Revolution. We've also got some copies of a great summary of the situation from the American Trial Lawyer magazine that came out in the fall of 2008 that I thought you all would be interested in. So thank you. Dr. Blank.
Let me tell you first about electromagnetic fields. There's a wide variety of electromagnetic fields, and we're in contact with virtually all of them. As you see, the scale I've got here on the slide shows that they start all the way from low frequency and they go all the way up past X-rays to cosmic rays, which we get coming from outer space. And the interesting thing about them is while man has divided them up into all these different frequency ranges, largely so that we can keep tabs on them and we can build different kinds of equipment to deal with them, they seem to show very similar kinds of properties, biological properties. In other words, the divisions are man-made, or shall I say physicist and engineer-made, but the effects are really biological across the entire spectrum. So the electromagnetic spectrum, when we talk about things, you see that the things that I'll tell you about in the very, very low part, the ELF, extremely low frequency power range, are not very different from the effects that occur in the radio frequency range, where we're talking about cell phones. And there are many similarities even with what's acknowledged to be very harmful above that dashed line which goes through the ultraviolet. That's called the boundary between ionizing and non-ionizing. Physicists like to point out that ionizing can knock electrons out of matter, but biologically you still get, even when you can't knock electrons out, you get biological reactions occurring. In fact, they occur all the way down to the bottom in the power frequency. So let me start going through some of these things and let you know that biologically, the electromagnetic spectrum seems to have a theme going through it, even from the very simplest low frequency kinds of effect ranges all the way up through the very high frequency. If we start at the very low frequency, it's been shown in many studies that you get a doubling of leukemia for children who are exposed to power lines. This is a study that was done for many, many years, and you have two papers that are referred to there. One was a pooled analysis that was done in the United States, another one that was done over in Europe, and they both agree that 3 to 4 milligauss, mg, that's a very, very low dose. Sitting in this room, I don't know with all the equipment we've got around here, but normally in rooms you get less than a milligauss, or the order of a milligauss. So this is a very, very low level of exposure in the power frequency range. Alzheimer's disease has been shown to double if you live within 50 meters of power lines. This is a recent study done in Switzerland, and it takes in a vast number of the population, so that you see that it's a very powerful study. And the interesting thing about that study is they were able to divide the population into those who lived for 5 years, and for 10 years, and for 15 years. And they show that there's a steadily increasing risk the longer you're exposed to it. This is known as a dose response, a very powerful argument for the fact that this is one of the contributing factors, if not the contributing factor, to what is being measured. Breast cancer is another thing that's been shown experimentally in the lab when you've got cells that can respond to very, very low fields between 2 and 12 milligauss. By the way, that Swiss study was, the fields are not stated in the paper, but you can estimate them from charts that have been published by the electric power industry. And the fields there are the order of 5 to 8 milligauss. So these are steady exposures over a long period of time that result in these things. But perhaps the most interesting study is the one I have listed last there, and it's published in a journal called Medical Hypotheses, and it just came out. And it's by Sam Millam, who's an epidemiologist who's been working in this area for many, many years. And he has mined a veritable trove of data that exist in the state capitals, all the places where people keep statistics, vital statistics. He has data on people who died from cardiovascular diseases, from cancer, from suicide, all these things over the last century. And he's analyzed them to show that there are differences in the rate of electrification in the United States. And as regions have electrified, the rate of disease has increased. And this is something that has occurred throughout the country. The difference between the North and the South, where the rate of electrification has been very different. The difference between rural areas and urban areas, where again the rates have been very different. It's fascinating to read that. And these are studies that aren't studies. In other words, these are data that have been amassed there, just waiting for us to analyze them. And when you analyze them, you come to the inevitable conclusion that Sam Millam is onto something. That these diseases that we refer to as diseases of civilization may perhaps be diseases of electrification. Our greater and greater exposure to the power lines, the ELF lines that exist in our society. Now we come to RF, radio frequency broadcasting. It's the same sort of range that you're dealing with cell phones. This is a study that was done in San Francisco. Sutro Tower supplies the radio power for much of San Francisco, if not all of it. It's certainly a large region of it. And you've got FM, TV, UHF antennas, and this study was done over a long period of time where there was an analysis of the cancers, all children's cancers in that population that were exposed. And you see the graph I've included here shows the risk ratio as a function of distance from the antenna. And it makes sense. The further you're away from the antenna, the lower the risk. But yet, if you take a look at the area there above at 3 kilometers, which is just 2 miles, I shouldn't say just, it's already 2 miles from the antenna, you get a risk ratio that's above 5. In other words, you've got 5 times greater rate of cancer among children than you would expect if you were living away from miles and miles away from it. Now, the interesting thing about this study is that the people doing the study measured the amount of energy that was coming out at that particular distance. And the energy that they measured, which was 1 microwatt per centimeter squared, is 1,000 times lower than the accepted safe rate. In other words, instead of 1 microwatt, the rating agencies say you're allowed 1 milliwatt per centimeter squared, and it's still considered safe. This is 1 microwatt, 1,000 times lower. So this is to show you how far out of whack these kinds of rating agencies are in connection with the real data that exists in the real world. Probably more relevant to most of you is the cell phone data, because this is something that people seem to be unable to go without. And yet you see that there's an increase in the OR, the odds ratio, for people who use cell phones. And you see that the odds ratio means that you go up to 2.7 or 2.1. You double your risk of gliomas. Now, gliomas are malignant brain tumors. Now, the interesting thing, if you look at the very bottom, the highest risk occurs when you start using a cell phone before the age of 20. And then it jumps to 5 times the rate. Now, can you imagine all young people who start using cell phones keep on using this, and this is just, they haven't been using it long enough yet to start seeing this huge increase in the rate. And people who know statistics, and who the man who runs the brain registry in the United States out of Berkeley has predicted that it's very likely that there'll be a huge takeoff because of the slow rate at which cancers develop. You don't go out and catch a pathogen cancer isn't like that. I mean, if you get exposed to the H1N1 virus, you will get the flu, the swine flu. But the thing is, if you're exposed to EMF and you start something, that process will take years and years to develop. In fact, most heart cancers take about 20 years. I have a friend who developed a mesothelioma from work that they could trace back to his exposure 35 years, because he only had been exposed over a 3-month period when he worked with a particular form of asbestos. So that most cancers take a long time to develop. And one of the surprising things about the current incidence of cancer is how early it is showing up. And I think it's a very important warning sign. Now, cancer is something that it's a dread disease, but we have an idea of how it develops. And we know that it develops as a result of mutations in DNA. And we know that ultraviolet and X-rays cause these mutations, and as a result, these mutations are carried along and they eventually start the process. Now, one of the things about DNA is that we've learned an awful lot about it in the last few years, well, I should say the last 50 years. It's been a real revolution in biology. And as a result, we can learn more about what the effects of EMF are on DNA. And if you look at the very bottom, you will see that the stress response is something that we've been able to study in our labs up at Columbia, down at Columbia in the medical school. We've been able to analyze to find that DNA is activated by very, very weak fields, as weak as the ELF fields. This is a picture of DNA. DNA is a long molecule. It's about 2 meters long, and most of us are not 2 meters long, and each cell has this DNA in it, and in order for it to fit, it's all crunched up. The DNA has got a lot of negative groups, and so it interacts with histones, which is a special kind of chemical that's positively charged, and together they form a compact ball, and they pack together inside the nucleus. But the DNA doesn't stay that way. I mean, when I grew up, I was taught biology that the nucleus is solid. It's there all the time. It contains the genetic information, and it's immutable, and things don't change. But the DNA is active all the time. It's making new proteins all the time. The way it makes new proteins is that it comes apart. These two chains down at the very end, the double helix, those lines that join it are chemicals called bases. And the bases contain a code that enables the cell to make particular proteins. And it's these proteins that are being made all the time to replace things that are needed. When damage occurs, this DNA cannot do the proper job. And it's this kind of damage that leads eventually in some way to the diseases that we refer to as the cancer diseases. By the way, cancer is not a disease. It's many kinds of diseases and of different kinds. Here's a case where people have done a study of exposing a nucleus that contains this ball of DNA to EMF, and this is again in the very weakest end of the electromagnetic spectrum, the ELF range. And you find that when you get the ball of DNA to move in an electric field, little pieces have been broken off, so that the exposure to the EMF causes pieces to come off. This is referred to as the comet assay because it looks like the tail on a comet. And there have been many studies, and you see that as low as 0.35 Gauss or 350 milligauss will cause this DNA to break. But we can cause the DNA to come apart and start making new proteins with the stress response. Now, the stress response is a response that cells make to let the body know, to let the cell know that it's in danger. Now, we know that when we feel danger or exposed to something bad, we have all these mechanisms that release adrenaline to mobilize us, release cortisol, the same thing that energize us to flee, to fight. That's at the level of organism. But we have each cell, almost each cell, has within it the ability to react to stress that comes. Bad stuff, like temperature increase. We should all be at the same temperature, at 98.6 inside. We should have the right acidity. We should not be exposed to bad chemicals. When that happens, the stress response is activated. It's a signal. The cell is telling you, we've got to mobilize our resources and do something good. Well, when EMF hits the cell starts responding with the stress response. The stress response tells you that the cell senses it as something potentially harmful. So it's that tells us, if you want to know whether EMF is harmful, Yes, the cell has told me in no uncertain terms. We have been able to understand a fair amount about how this DNA comes apart in terms of reactions that we have studied. And I just went over rather quickly a group of reactions that I had down there to show you that they occur at very, very low levels. But I wanted to get to this, which is a picture of the DNA that's involved in activating the stress response. We can actually analyze the DNA that responds to the EMF field. And we can find out that there are pieces of the DNA that respond specifically to EMF. You see the part that's in a box on the left-hand side, the EMF domain. That piece will respond to EMF. If you take that piece out, you take an EMF signal, you'll get no response. There's another area called the heat shock domain, which will respond only to changes in temperature. And that too will not occur if you remove that piece. The interesting thing about this is that they contain, the red boxes there contain particular bases that respond to the electric and magnetic fields. They have bases that will allow electrons to move very rapidly and to move away. And so we've been able to develop a mechanism that will explain it based on the ability of even weak fields to move electrons within the DNA structure and to allow an explanation of how such weak fields can cause the effect that we actually measure. Another thing we can do with this is we can take out the piece that's EMF sensitive, and that's what we've done. And we put it into something else that can act as a detector, which we call a reporter gene. In other words, another gene that we want to activate. So we're going to use that piece of EMF domain, DNA, to respond to the ambient field. And when we do that, we use two reporter genes. One is chloramphenyl acetyltransferase, and another one luciferase. And we show you with the tall red columns there that we get a response. In other words, we've been able to take a piece of DNA that's EMF sensitive, put it into something else, and get a response out of it, which means that we have identified the piece that is EMF sensitive in the DNA. And by the way, Columbia University has the patent on that, and someday someone may want to use an EMF switch in a device that wants it to be used internally. So this would be a very effective way of doing that sort of thing. Now, these kinds of results that I mentioned to you are just a few of the results that tell you that EMF is an important, has important effects biologically. And these were assembled in the Bioinitiative report, the Pathophysiology report, and the European Parliament was able to go over these things and act independently of the rating agencies and say that something must be done to bring the standards that exist into line with the science that has been developing. So let me pull this all together and summarize it by saying that EMF is linked to many health risks that we find across the entire spectrum: ELF, RF, and including ionizing radiation. We have an increased understanding of biology that supports that the effect is occurring on DNA, and we can understand that, the mechanism of how it may work. The current safety standards are not based on the biology, and they're not protective by many orders of magnitude. They are off at least by a factor of 1,000. And the spread of EMF in our society requires far better control and far better regulation. Thank you.
Our next speaker is Whitney North Seymour, who is an attorney who was former New York State Senator and U.S. Attorney from the Southern District of New York. He was also co-founder of the Natural Resources Defense Council and has been a advocate for environment for a very long time. Thank you very much for being here.
Thank you, and thank both of you for being out there leading the charge. Actually, I'm not Whitney North Seymour. That was my father, who was a class of 1921 at Columbia Law School. And he used to like to talk about the latest technology that emerged while he was a student here at the law school. In the old building, in the men's room, they installed one of those latest devices that was put on the wall where you could push a button and hot air would come out so you could dry your hands without having to use a towel. And some classmate had put a sign on top of this new marvel which said, "Press the button and hear Professor Corwin on constitutional law." I'm going to try to keep the hot air to a minimum and concentrate as a lawyer on what do we do about these problems that these extraordinary people have identified for you. Obviously, we're talking about two different kinds of issues. You have, on the one hand, cell phones, which are a matter of personal choice. An individual can decide whether or not to use a cell phone, although it's pretty hard to decide not to. And then you have the transmitters, as to which individuals have no choice. If a transmitter is put up next to where you live or where your kids go to school, you've got to take it unless you can do something about it. That's the area I want to concentrate on primarily, but let me just mention that in terms of cell phones, there are two legal lines of attack. One is the tort issue. There have been some cases, and there will be more as they go along, suing makers of cell phones for causing brain tumors and other conditions. Though the problems of proof in those cases are extraordinary, and they really are more down the line as the effects accumulate. There also are possible tort causes of action for nuisance against property owners who make money off of putting up cell towers, particularly private property owners, involving those boxes you see on apartment houses all around. Actually, I am currently consulting with some people who live down in the village about some box antennas in the commercial building out next to their open space out back, which are putting out terribly high emission levels that would make Martin Blank say, "I think I'll go home and not stay around here very long." So there is an emerging tort possibility in the field of property law there. But let me concentrate for just a couple of minutes about the present opportunity for lawyers, and that is people who want to stop cell towers from going up near their schools or near nursing homes or more particularly near residential neighborhoods. There's a threshold statutory problem that makes that kind of litigation or administrative proceeding extraordinarily difficult, and that is that the Congress in 1996, responding to the millions of dollars of lobbying funds that were showered on them, passed a statute which said that if the FCC sets regulations on the power level of emissions, that preempts all state and local regulation. So that and of course you can't get a license from the FCC without complying with those standards. So for all practical purposes, every new cell transmitter that goes up cannot be challenged because of its environmental impact. Well, there are some peepholes into that regulation, some openings, and I've been involved in a number of them. One is to challenge the obsolescence of those regulations. They were based on 1985 research. They were adopted in 1996. As you've just heard, the amount of research that has taken place since then showing biological effects has been extraordinary, most of it in Europe, but plainly somebody has got to update those regulations to address the biological effects, which will begin to provide a new level and standard on placement of towers near sensitive people like the children and elderly and electrosensitive and human beings when they go to bed at night. How do you do that as a lawyer? Well, generally speaking, in a community, some committee will get together and say, we've just gotten word that somebody, the XYZ tower company, or Sprint or Nextel or somebody else, is planning to put up a tower at this location. What can we do about it? I've been involved in at least 2 of those cases where we actually mounted a sufficient lawyer attack that those companies withdrew their applications. They just didn't want to take on the battles. There are others where you have to fight to the mat, and that we have a case pending up in the federal court in Connecticut where we are fighting to the mat against a tower which happens to be located not only near residences and a school, but it's also in a migratory bird flyway, and therefore arguably violates the Migratory Treaty Act. And as many of you know, treaties take priority over statutes, and so we hope a federal judge up there is going to say, you can't put it here. But there are other issues that come out in the cases on how you can locate them, how you can limit their location. And there is a channel to go from the administrative decision up on an expedited basis to the federal courts. So there are some things that can be done about it, and some of you will have opportunities to do something about it. Those of you who care about the environment as opposed to the human issues should take a look at some of the studies coming out of Europe as the impact on the fertility of birds, small mammals, amphibians. They're extraordinary what the scientific evidence has shown as to the adverse impact on propagation of wildlife. And that is now one of the cutting edges for lawyers. Some years ago, the Second Circuit lawyers and judges met up in Manchester, Vermont, and they were greeted by then Governor Stafford of Vermont, who went on to be a United States Senator. And Stafford greeted the lawyers and judges by telling them about his experience as Attorney General of Vermont, where they have such a small office, the Attorney General has to argue some of the appeals. And he was arguing an appeal, he said, before the Supreme Court of Vermont, and it involved real property issues that went back before the Revolution. And he went on and on and on, and the judges, we could see their eyes were wandering, and finally, to get their attention, he leaned forward and said, well, Your Honors, I've been arguing here for about 3 hours, and as far as I can see, I might as well have been hitting my head up against a stone wall. And at that, the Chief Justice leaned forward and said, well, frankly, Mr. Attorney General, in your case, I can think of no one who could do so with less risk of personal injury. It takes that kind of hard-headedness to be a lawyer in this field today, but these are very important issues that affect our present and the future of our country and indeed our world. So those of you who have a flicker of interest, I urge you to stay in it and try your hand. Now, we've got 15 minutes, I think, plus for questions and answers. So Camilla, why don't you come up and be maitre d'?
Okay. Martin? All right, thank you very much. Okay, so questions? Yes?
I'm wondering if in those cases, do you seek to try to get the cell phone tower, the people responsible for putting the towers there, to compensate for the risk they're putting on the plaintiffs, or are you trying to kind of prove that this is why these symptoms are caused by the cell phone, by the towers?
I'm not sure I got your question completely, but let me take a crack, and if I'm not answering it, tell me so. In the case of cell towers, the big issue is distance. As you've heard, the further away you get from a transmitter, the safer you are. The studies in Europe have essentially shown that it's within 400 meters of a cell tower that the health effects take place. There are other studies that show that within 200 meters of a cell tower that the damage to the fertility of wildlife takes place. So the simple answer for a lawyer is to go in and persuade a judge, judge, don't allow these towers to be placed within 400 yards or meters of residential areas or schools. And those are the arguments that have been made, and indeed a number of zoning ordinances have locally been now adopted, saying you may not put a cell tower within 1,500 feet of a residence, for example. You cannot stop the cell towers under the FCC statute. You cannot stop the cell towers from coming. What you can control is their placement. Where do you put them? And where you put them still provides ample service for cell phones, but it protects the people and the environment. And that's really the direction that lawyers, I think, can be most effective. Did I answer your question, or did I miss it?
Oh, well, I think I asked my question wrong. Maybe I should have applied it to cell phone use. You said that there were serious proof issues with cases about cell phones use. So then do lawyers try to argue that, say, the cell phone use imposes, what, a 5% risk? Or do they still try to argue that this person developed a brain tumor because of this use of cell phone? And in which case, it seems like you'd have to disprove everything else that this person does.
Law on personal injury, you got to have cause and effect. You got to show that the brain tumor came from the cell phone, and the number of expert witnesses you can find who will say that are probably zero. There may be one or two, but it's the problem of proof of the cause and effect that really is slowing down those cases. And because you can get brain tumors from a lot of different causes, and you've got to really isolate it and say it's the cell phone that did this, and that's why those are extremely difficult cases. And in time, there will be enough evidence accumulating through these various studies to finally say, let a jury say, yes, it was the use of that cell phone without adequate standards that caused the brain tumor and the death or whatever the side effects were.
Any other questions? Yeah.
Hello. I was just wondering if you could comment quickly on the lobbying that is at work at the moment to try to change the Telecommunications Act, and because I always thought that there was like a principle of precaution that is applied, for instance, in food safety, these kind of issues. But here it's inverted, which means that we just assume that there is no problem until it's demonstrated, which is very difficult to do. So I mean, what is done at the moment to try to change the law and to change the presumption that everything is fine with wireless networks?
Well, recently, a lot of international scientists on this issue met in Norway 10 days ago to pull their heads together and try to figure out how to explain to global governments what the exposure levels should be and why. And so that communique will come out sometime in the new year after it's peer-reviewed and published, and so hopefully that will have an impact on convincing governments that we need to lower exposures. Did that answer your question, or it wasn't clear where you were going with? Yeah, okay. Yes.
Dr. Blank, you mentioned that scientists have identified the gene that is EMF sensitive. I believe you said that.
And your question?
Did you, I mean, I heard you...
No, actually, technically, what's been done is we know that the gene responds. This was the gene for one of the stress response proteins. And we've isolated a section of that gene that's called a promoter and been able to manipulate that and put it somewhere else and show that that is EMF sensitive.
I see.
There's no gene that is EMF.
I didn't think so. I didn't think so. That's why I wanted to ask you that question. But as I understand it, it's really the electromagnetic frequencies have a negative effect on our electromagnetic energy. And I'm wondering if through all of your research, have you found, has anybody come up with something that can protect the human being from this situation.
Well, I didn't go over I skipped over one of the slides there that showed that the electromagnetic fields react not only to DNA, in other words, activates DNA, which would mean a variety of genes, because a lot of DNA is affected, but they also affect proteins. They can get enzymes to work. Our current thinking is that it will react with electrons wherever they find them. If the electrons are very tightly bound, they won't move very much. But if you notice in DNA, the electrons that are on the bases between the double helix, the electrons are delocalized. In fact, people refer to the electrons in that range as a pi wave because they are the pi electrons, which differ from the normal bonding electrons when you have a chemical bond. What I'm trying to say is an electron is an electron, and the electromagnetic field will react with it wherever it finds it. Certain electrons will move more easily because they are not bound as strongly, and those are the ones, I think, in the DNA that are more easily moved. In the enzymes, the electrons that seem to be affected are those that are involved in reactions, so that we may catch them in motion, en passant, and we get those things when they are actually being transferred. So it's a very dynamic picture. As you see, I'm talking with my hands, and whenever we do hand waving, that means that the concept isn't adequately defined to be able to put it into words without moving the hands.
Right. You know, I'm not a scientist, but is there even a step in front of what you're explaining? Because have you heard anything about noise field technology that may have a beneficial effect on rendering this field more compatible or not as negative to the human being?
Ted Linovitz, who died a couple of years ago down at Catholic University, did a fair amount of research on the effect of electromagnetic noise. We're talking about coherent signals. That's what carries the information we transmit from one to the other.
Right.
But if you put on noise onto this signal that is comparable in magnitude to the signal, you can actually block the signal. You can block the effect of the signal. He didn't show any effect of the noise other than the blocking of the signal. But my guess is that at some point the noise itself may become a problem.
Right.
When you've got a whole lot of electromagnetic noise around, you don't know what's doing the filtering, and you may get sections, parts of your body that are particularly tuned to one of the frequencies in that noise. Noise is a whole lot of frequencies together.
Right. Okay, thank you.
What I recommend to people is simply to just shield their environment, to focus instead of on these other technologies and pendants and things that are being sold, to focus on just shielding your home, making sure that your bedroom is shielded. If you've got high levels, there are paints now that you can buy that will block the radiation. There are films you can put on the windows. There are fabrics now that will block it out 99.9%. So, you know, you can find links to that kind of information on electromagnetic.health.org. And the bedroom is the most important environment because we're way more sensitive to electromagnetic fields at night, and we need to rest and repair. Yes?
I had a question for Dr. Blank. I'm not sure I'm following on the DNA. Is it that the hydrogen bonds are more disrupted by the electromagnetic waves than other stronger bonds?
Well, the hydrogen bonds are the bonds that keep the double helix together, and they are not disrupted so much as what the whole dynamic of what keeps macromolecules together is more complicated. It's hard to describe in a few words, but basically, one of the studies I did was with hemoglobin, which contains 4 different proteins, and they hang together. And they stay that way in our circulation. If you change the pH, which means if you add just a little bit of a hydrogen ion, extra hydrogen ion, these 4 groups will break up into 2 groups of 2. Now, what you've done is you haven't really broken up this big molecule. What you've done is you've changed the equilibrium so that water will now get in preference. When you've created an extra charge on the protein, the water will come in and hydrate that, and it will change the balance of forces so that you get the molecule to come apart. These are known as solvation forces, and they cause so you can get a lot of mileage for a small change in charge, and I think that's what causes the DNA to go apart. If you move an electron along the DNA chain, you carry a negative charge to a place which wasn't there before, and that will encourage hydration to come in, and that will be sufficient to break the chains apart locally. And that's enough for the enzyme to come in, RNA polymerase, to start the process of making the new RNA, to make the new protein.
Any further questions? Yes.
Okay. A while back, I want to say it was about maybe a year ago, I had been watching, I think it was Larry King Live, and it was addressing autism, and there were some mothers and doctors, and it was to do with, you know, saying that vaccines were essentially, you know, which we've all heard, causing the huge upsurge. But then a particular doctor who was arguing against vaccines being the culprit said that he had been treating the Amish for 10 years, and he'd only seen like one case of autism, and that presumably they had been receiving vaccines and everything else. But then, you know, my mother and I looked at each other, and we said, well, they don't have any, you know, they have very few electronic devices there, and because that's part of their religion or their ethos to not have, you know, electrical appliances. So I'm not sure who I'm directing this to, but I mean that whole link with autism and the fact, I mean, have studies been done in areas of the world where there is very little of this electromagnetic pollution and therefore a link with low autism rates? Mm-hmm.
Let me respond to that, and then I'll turn it over to Dr. Blank. There is a study on my website. It has not been published, but it was a small study that measured the electromagnetic field levels in the bedroom environments of pregnant women, and also measured the body voltage of the person lying in the bed at that location, and and compared it to the electromagnetic field levels in the location of bedroom environments of women that had normal children, and the levels were 22 times higher in the children in the bedrooms that had where there were autistic children. So that is reason to be alarmed and to start putting funding into more research on the EMF autism connection. It's of great concern. There are people that think that one of the mechanisms of action, which is known as the decalcification of the cell wall, and there are people that believe that mechanism could be the reason why there has been such a tremendous growth in autism. We now have one in 91 children today have autism, and that's up from 1 in 150 in 2002. So this trajectory that we're on does not look good, and you're right, we need to be focused more on it. Dr. Blank?
No, I think your instincts are quite well developed. I think that you're saying more or less the same thing that the Millam paper in Medical Hypotheses has been saying, that a lot of the things that we attribute to all kinds of other causes may just be consequences of electrification.
Okay, thank you.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Any other questions before we leave? Okay, thank you very much, and please pick up a book on your way out. There's a brown box there with books. Take home, and thank you.
May I say a word on behalf of the lawyers here? Thanks to these two pioneers who are giving so much of their time to educate us on the hard facts that we can then use to try to do something to help society. Much obliged.